Stop and actually think about this for a second. You're about to give birth in 100,000 BC. There is no epidural, no C-section, no blood transfusion if something goes wrong, no way to monitor fetal heart rate, no sterile environment, no trained obstetrician, just you, the people around you, and whatever knowledge your community has accumulated across generations of watching women do exactly this, and sometimes not survive it. Now ask yourself honestly, what would you actually do? Because our ancestors figured it out, and the answer is more extraordinary than you'd expect. This is one of the most dangerous, most universal, and most completely overlooked chapters in the entire story of our species. Every single human being alive today, all 8 billion of us, got here because an ancient woman survived this. Survived it without a hospital, without modern drugs, without any of the infrastructure we have built specifically to make this process survivable. And for a very long time, a significant number of them didn't survive it. But enough did. Enough always did. And the reason enough did is not luck. It is knowledge. Hard-won, generationally accumulated, passed from woman to woman around fires, and in forests and in caves across hundreds of thousands of years of painful, costly, irreplaceable experience. Let's go. First, let's establish how dangerous this actually was. Because we tend to romanticize ancient human life in one of two directions, either as brutal and short and terrifying, or as somehow natural and harmonious and fine. The reality of ancient childbirth sits in neither of those places. It sits in something more complicated and more honest. Researchers studying skeletal remains from prehistoric and early historical populations estimate maternal mortality at somewhere between 1 in 100 and 1 in 10 per birth, depending on the population, the time period, the environment, and the available support. 1 in 10. In a world where a woman might give birth 6, 7, or 8 times across her reproductive life, that cumulative risk was not theoretical. It was a near statistical certainty for a meaningful portion of every community. The bones of young women found in ancient burial sites across Europe, Africa, and Asia tell this story with a consistency that is impossible to ignore. Pelvic fractures, evidence of obstructed labor, death in the late teens and early 20s at exactly the age when first births most commonly occur. And here's the thing that makes this genuinely heartbreaking. The human birth canal is extraordinarily narrow relative to the size of the human infant's head. This is not a coincidence, and it is not a flaw. It is the direct consequence of two competing evolutionary pressures pulling in opposite directions at the same time. On one side, bipedalism. Walking upright on 2 legs required a narrower pelvis. The geometry of upright walking and the geometry of easy childbirth are fundamentally in conflict. On the other side, intelligence. Bigger brains meant bigger heads, which meant larger infants that were increasingly difficult to deliver through that increasingly narrow canal. Evolution essentially put our ancestors in an impossible situation and left them to figure it out. They did. But it cost them. Here's where the story stops being only about death and starts being about something extraordinary. Because ancient humans did not simply accept this risk and hope for the best, they built systems. Sophisticated, detailed, empirically refined systems of knowledge and practice designed specifically to improve the odds of survival for both mother and infant. The first and most important thing they did was something so obvious it barely sounds like a strategy at all. They did not do it alone. Humans are one of the only species on Earth where other members of the community routinely assist during birth. Anthropologists call this cooperative breeding, and it appears to be ancient, possibly as old as our species itself. The presence of a knowledgeable, experienced attendant during childbirth is not a modern medical invention. It is one of the oldest forms of specialized knowledge in human history. The midwife, in some form, predates agriculture, predates pottery, predates every institution we associate with civilization. She was there first. And what did she know? More than you might expect. Archaeological evidence from sites across the ancient world shows consistent patterns of specific plant use in birthing contexts. Ergot, a fungus that grows on grains, contains compounds that stimulate uterine contractions. It is, in effect, a natural precursor to the synthetic drugs we use today to manage labor and prevent postpartum hemorrhage. Ancient midwives across multiple cultures independently identified this plant and used it. Not because they understood the biochemistry, because they watched what happened when they used it and what happened when they didn't. That is science. It just wasn't written down. Blue cohosh, raspberry leaf, squaw vine. These plants appear in ancient birthing contexts from North America to Europe to Asia. Many of them contain compounds we now know have genuine physiological effects on the uterus and on the process of labor. Ancient women were not using random folk remedies. They were using an empirical pharmacopoeia built from generations of observation, passed down through oral tradition, refined through a process of trial and error that was slow and sometimes fatal, but ultimately extraordinarily effective. Here is something modern obstetrics rediscovered relatively recently that ancient midwives apparently never forgot. Upright birthing positions, standing, squatting, kneeling on all fours, are biomechanically superior to lying flat on your back. Lying flat, the position that became standard in Western hospital births largely for the convenience of the attending physician rather than the comfort or safety of the mother, actually works against the natural mechanics of labor. It compresses blood vessels. It reduces the diameter of the pelvic outlet. It makes the process harder, longer, and more dangerous. Ancient women, universally and across cultures, gave birth upright. Squatting specifically uses gravity, opens the pelvic outlet by up to 30% compared to lying down, and significantly reduces the duration of the second stage of labor. Archaeological evidence, birthing bricks found in ancient Egypt, birthing stools in ancient Greece and Rome, iconographic evidence from cultures across the world, all points to the same upright position that biomechanics tells us is correct. They figured this out not through anatomy textbooks, but through the accumulated observation of thousands of births across thousands of years. They were right. We forgot. Then we remembered again. The social architecture around childbirth in ancient communities was also significantly more sophisticated than we tend to assume. In most documented ancient and indigenous cultures, childbirth was an exclusively female domain. Men were excluded. This was not simply custom or superstition, though it was framed in those terms. It was a practical information boundary. The knowledge of childbirth, its management, its complications, its remedies, lived in communities of women and was transmitted between them. Excluding men from the birthing space was, among other things, a way of preserving and protecting a body of knowledge that was too important to be diluted or disrupted by people who had no direct experience of the process. Here's the uncomfortable part. When formalized medicine, almost exclusively male-dominated for most of its institutional history, took over the management of childbirth in the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe, maternal mortality did not go down. In many cases, it went up. The introduction of male physicians into birthing rooms, combined with the practice of moving birth into hospitals where doctors performed surgery and autopsies in the same spaces without understanding germ theory, created conditions that killed women who would have survived at home with a midwife. The women who had accumulated and transmitted this knowledge for hundreds of thousands of years were systematically pushed out of the process by an institution that was, for a critical period, demonstrably worse at the thing it was replacing. Ignaz Semmelweis, the Hungarian physician who in the 1840s proved that doctors washing their hands between performing autopsies and delivering babies would dramatically reduce maternal deaths, was laughed out of the medical establishment. Ridiculed, institutionalized, died before his ideas were accepted. The midwives he was trying to emulate, the ones who had been practicing cleanliness in birthing contexts for millennia without knowing why it worked, just knowing that it did, had known something he had to fight his entire career to prove. Think about what it took. Not the pain, though, that was real and constant and unimaginable by modern standards. The knowledge, the courage of the women who attended births, knowing that things could go wrong, and that when they did, there was a limit to what they could do. The courage of the women who gave birth, knowing the same thing. And the extraordinary collective human project of passing what they learned forward. Not in books, not in medical journals, not in any form that history chose to preserve, but in the hands and the voices and the lived experience of women who showed up for each other in the most dangerous moment of human life, generation after generation after generation, for 100,000 years. Every person alive today is the result of that chain holding. Somewhere in your ancestry, a woman survived something ancient medicine had only the most basic tools to manage. She survived because someone was there who knew what to do. Someone who had learned it from someone else who had learned it the hard way. That knowledge passed forward unbroken to you, encoded not in text but in the simple, stubborn fact that you exist. That is not a small thing. That is the whole thing.